safety crisis at Southwest Airlines. And joining us is Darrell Whitman, was a federal investigator with the Whistleblower Protection Program in OSHA, and also was involved in a case at FedEx where FedEx had retaliated against whistleblowers at LAX who had complained about serious health and safety problems there. And Darrell, welcome to WorkWeek Radio. Why don't you talk about what you've learned about what's going on and why there is really a big cover-up of the health and safety problems at that airline? Southwest Airlines, yeah.
FedEx is still in the mix here. There's serious problems, obviously, with FedEx. It's partly their business model. And what links FedEx to Southwest is they both use a similar business model. And that is they buy old planes. The entire fleet for Southwest are 737s, Boeing 737s. They're 30 to 40-year-old aircraft, and when you have old aircraft, they require a lot of maintenance and repair. And there's now some concern by the FAA, in fact, that their business model, Southwest business model, was a contributing factor to this incident that happened where this woman died. And that is because these old planes with these older engines, the other part of Southwest model is they have to keep their planes in the air. That's why it's like, taking the bus somewhere. You land 4 times to get across the country. But every time that you go through landing and takeoff with the plane, you have to rev up the engines. They cool down. There's a lot of stress, a lot more stress than if you have a nonstop flight from New York to San Francisco. So if it was a new plane, if they were using really high-class, relatively new planes, it might not be so much of a problem. But it's certainly when you put that part of their business model on top of their business model to buy old planes and try to maintain them, you're really doubling down on the problem. Well, now that's come out, the FAA, and I don't think that this has been covered nationally, the FAA has been looking at Southwest for over a year, in part because the union, the Southwest Union, has been raising holy hell about management and the fact that management is maintaining a very chilled workplace and attacking mechanics when they report problems. They have this one report that just came out a couple of days ago in Los Angeles that a mechanic who reported rust, a corrosion on one of the gear segments of one of the planes, was hauled into a disciplinary hearing. Instead of being rewarded and applauded, it's like, well, he's raising issues that are going to cost money. So there's an extremely chilled workplace now at Southwest with its mechanics, and even the FAA has noted that. The problem, what brings me into this case is before this incident where this woman was killed, there were 16 separate complaints, health and safety complaints, filed by Southwest mechanics with regard to, we don't know. And we don't know because OSHA dismissed all the complaints. And they came in a matter of just a couple of months. There wasn't much daylight between them. And when they were dismissed, the way that you get, try to get some kind of justice is you appeal the dismissal to the administrative law courts, which they did. So here you had 16 separate complaints appealed to the administrative law court, and it's starting in January of this year. And I think that the court kind of threw up its hands and said, how are we going to deal with 16 separate cases? So they started grouping them, which is totally inappropriate. And they had 3 different groups, 5, and 6 complaints, and they were going to launch an investigation, which they're supposed to do. But in the midst of this, the attorney who represents every one of the whistleblowers negotiated with the company, Southwest, for a settlement, and the court and the administrative law court sealed the settlement. So nobody knows. Nobody knows what the complaints were. Nobody knows what the resolution was. There was no investigation either by OSHA or by the administrative law courts. 16 separate complaints. So you're looking at really a catastrophic failure of the regulatory process. We can't have this. This is not serving the public interest at all. And the reality is Southwest Airlines has a long history of problems of health and safety issues. They had the top of one of their planes blow off a couple of years ago down in Phoenix. There's been a lot of complaints about people being left on planes because they land and they're there for 30, 40 minutes and they take off again. But it appears over the last 18 years, there's been 262 separate operational violations of aircraft by Southwest, and they've been fined over $17 million. So and that's an average of 14 citations a year and $1 million a year in fines. So that's sort of, if you have a car and it breaks down that regularly, and it's costing you that much money, at some point somebody needs to step in and say, wait a minute, there's some basic problems here. We don't want the flying public to be put at risk because there's an airline that insists on lowballing their health and safety maintenance so they can squeeze out a few more dollars in profit.
Well, we're speaking with Darrell Whitman. He's a lawyer and investigator. He was working for Federal OSHA at the Whistleblower Protection Program, and he was trying to defend whistleblowers at FedEx and has some experience with the airlines. And now you're saying, Darrell, that in fact the FAA and OSHA really kind of covered up the serious systemic safety problems at the airline?
Well, not just OSHA, but the Department of Labor, their administrative law courts. What you're seeing here is you're seeing systemic corruption that's resulting in serious risks, health and safety risks to the public. You've got, the FAA who can't find the doorknob to investigate. This was the FedEx cases. And now, here they've been involved with Southwest for the last year, a company that has a long history of problems, and they're unable to pull the trigger and get anything done. That the employees, I'm sure at least for their own safety as much as the flying public, come in groups, to OSHA to make reports about the problem, and OSHA throws them out the door. And then when they try to get justice from the Department of Labor law courts, administrative law courts, they face a situation where they're basically muzzled. We can't do this. This is not something we can tolerate.
And you're saying that actually these workers put their jobs on the line by going to OSHA to get rectification, to get the airline to properly maintain the planes. And the union AMFA has put out a letter to the government saying that in fact they were outsourcing a lot of the work and they could not really know what was going on with the planes whose mechanical repairs were being outsourced. Did that have anything to do with it?
Well, they don't know. I mean, obviously it's going to take a while to sort out on this specific incident what caused the failure of the engine. But, we can't just look one dot here and one dot there. We need to connect the dots. And this business of outsourcing maintenance is not just Southwest. It's FedEx does this regularly. It's a big problem all through the airline industry. They're going to the Philippines to Thailand, to a lot of low-wage countries, and if they're in the neighborhood, they land their planes there and they put up a maintenance shop, and they have. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the folks that are there, but they just simply don't have the same standards. There's nobody to enforce the health and safety regulations at these remote sites. It's a way of dodging the regulatory system, to save a few bucks at the expense of the public.
And Bret Oestreich, who's the national director of the Aircraft Mechanics Fraternal Association, AMFA, warned that this outsourcing was contributing to a dangerous situation. He said that 75% of the maintenance work was farmed out to third-party vendors, and that this was actually meant that you could really not check on the whether or not the work had been done properly as a result of outsourcing.
Exactly, and that's of course the purpose of the outsourcing is to go to the lowest cost place to get your work done, and then bring your planes back and make most of your money here in the States, on these short haul flights. So it's sort of a globalization issue, if you want to look at it that way. But internationally, we don't have these standards. We don't have a system in place to ensure that planes, are safe regardless of where you're flying in the world. And certainly there are airlines and air carriers in other countries that don't have particularly high standards and have problems repeatedly. There's also a lot of companies. My favorite is Lufthansa, which I fly most of the time if I fly, because they have strong unions. And they would never tolerate, their unions would never tolerate this kind of management system. Plus, Germany has co-management between labor and the investors and the senior CEOs. So the employees, the union representatives, actually sit on the board of directors.
Now, the issue of also is criminal negligence.
Yes.
Is there criminal negligence in a situation like this?
Well, of course, that's the legal proposition, criminal negligence. Potentially, of course, if they're cutting corners and knowing that it increases the risks to the flying public, and it results in injury and death, then yes, that's potentially criminal negligence. We don't have a lot of cases where the government goes in and actually prosecutes criminal negligence in the workplace. It has happened a few times, and it should happen a lot more, because ultimately there are people who make these decisions. These aren't done by the company. It's not Southwest as a company. It's the managers, the senior managers, and the CEO and the rest of these folks who are making these choices. And if you don't hold them individually accountable, then they'll just pass off fines as the cost of doing business, and they'll keep flying, and they'll keep degrading maintenance and putting their passengers at risk.
And we're talking again with Darrell Whitman. He is a lawyer and investigator with OSHA, who was the Whistleblower Protection Program, who was actually terminated for trying to defend workers who made health and safety complaints. And that was under Tom Perez, who was the head of the Department of Labor under Obama. And in your case, you're saying there was an obstruction of law because they refused to investigate. But now in OSHA and the Department of Labor, you have Acosta. You have a executive appointed by President Trump. Has anything changed at OSHA or the Department of Labor?
I don't, until you reminded me that Mr. Acosta was Secretary of Labor, I don't remember him ever appearing in the public about anything. Is he really the Department of Labor Secretary?
He seems to be MIA. There's even the media, there's no question about OSHA and where's Acosta. Where are these officials who we're paying, the taxpayers paying to protect our health and safety? Where are they?
Well, as far as Mr. Acosta is concerned, again, I have very little knowledge about what he's doing because he's kind of a non-person at the moment. And the corporate media doesn't seem interested in giving us information about real things. So, until something dramatic happens, you don't hear about what these people are or aren't doing. I have to say this, I'm working with the Office of Special Counsel at the moment. And up until basically the middle of October of last year, it was an office that was run by Obama appointees. It was horrible. It was one of the great facilitators of corruption in the federal government. And so, the one good thing, from my perspective at least, that Trump has done is he appointed Henry Kerner as the new chief counsel, and they're serious about enforcing the law. I've talked to him. I've talked to some of the other folks in there, and they're libertarians. They think the law matters.
Well, it would seem that in this case of Southwest Airlines and the effort to basically get rid of the OSHA complaints and seal them so they were secret from the people, it seems like there should be a violation of the law with that. I mean, it's like a conspiracy with the RICO to cover up the serious health and safety problems at Southwest Airlines.
I have drafted and will send Mr. Kerner a memo with regard to all of this. He's a busy man. They've got a lot of complaints, not just mine. But I want to inform him about what I have discovered about the situation with OSHA and Southwest. And I'm going to ask him to investigate, which is what they do. That's what the Office of Special Counsel does. So I'm hoping that they'll go in and they'll get the documents and they'll review them and they'll compare them with the law and the procedure that's supposed to happen here to protect the public interest. And the Office of Special Counsel is a very, very powerful agency. They can order not only corrective action, in terms of telling people not to do this or to do that, but they also have the power to issue indictments for criminal offenses. So and I do believe if Mr. Kerner new staff find violations of law in conducting these investigations that they're going to start conducting very shortly, they will issue subpoenas. They will issue indictments, make referrals for criminal prosecution. I have very little doubt about that.
And Darrell, lastly, I wanted to talk with you about the recent developments at Hunters Point Bayview, where Tetra Tech middle managers pleaded guilty. They were in prison for falsifying tests at the U.S. Naval Shipyard. Over $1 billion has been spent by the public, by taxpayers, to clean it up. And apparently up to 95% of some parcels have been falsified. The tests have been falsified. They have people living in houses in the project. There's been total silence by Congresswoman Pelosi and Senator Feinstein about this $1 billion eco-fraud. It's the largest in the United States. What is going on at Hunters Point Bayview? And you had a worker who went to you, Michael Madry, to complain about falsification of tests by Test America, which was owned at that time by HIG Capital. What's happening there?
Well, Mr. Madry and I have been engaged with this issue of Hunters Point since 2014. Mr. Madry was a regional quality assurance manager for EM Labs P&K, which is a subsidiary of Test America, the nation's largest industrial environmental testing company. And he became aware, and I became aware of the issues being raised about what was happening at Hunters Point, partly because one of the issues was asbestos testing. And Mr. Madry knew and has the documentation that his former employer is, first of all, continuing to falsify asbestos tests 9 years on, because the EPA can't find the door handle either to stop it. But he also knew that some of the work at Hunters Point was shopped out to EM Labs P&K. So he had a connection. And when NBC Bay Area started covering the story in 2014, Mr. Madry and I got together, put our heads together, and started talking about it. He began to talk to people. He and I both talked to Miss Wagner, the reporter down in San Jose, about what he knew. And Mr. Madry's been very proactive on this. He tried to go to the U.S. Attorney about it, gave the U.S. Attorney considerable documentation, about the falsification of testing and the involvement of Test America EM Labs with Hunters Point. And he got no response. I sent documents to Senator Feinstein in September of 2014, which included Mr. Madry's case and report, implicating this testing company in falsification of tests for major projects. So Miss Senator Feinstein's office, at least, Carson Niello, her aide, senior aide here in San Francisco, they knew that there were serious problems. If they read anything in all the documents I gave them, they would easily have discovered there were serious problems, and potentially the problems led to Hunters Point. And as soon as they began to look at the documents and understand the breadth and depth of the corruption, they just bailed out completely. Sorry, can't help you.
And we're speaking with Darrell Whitman. He's a lawyer, investigator who was retaliated against at OSHA by the Department of Labor, Tom Perez, who was running it at that time, who was investigating complaints of whistleblowers and then himself became a target. And Senator Dianne Feinstein's husband, Richard Blum, who's also on the Board of Regents, and the workers are striking UC today, AFSCME and other workers, for a living wage, decent conditions. But apparently he has part ownership of the construction company Citations, which is actually has a contract with Lennar, which is developing Hunters Point Bayview and also Treasure Island. Do you think there's a financial interest by Senator Feinstein and Congresswoman Pelosi to keep this project going?
There's a reason why San Francisco was used to be called Baghdad by the Bay. Development in not just San Francisco, but in California generally, developers have always been a shady lot. And there's long history of things like Hunters Point going on for the last century or so. They're major players in the politics of the state, so they have major interests. It's just in the nature of their business to get involved in politics. I would find it hard to believe that that there aren't connections. I think it'd be much easier to show the connections than to prove that they don't exist.
So do you think that there's financial connections that actually come to the surface as far as a RICO, as far as a conspiracy? And that was one of the reasons that both Congresswoman Pelosi, whose uncle or whose cousin was on an executive with Lennar Development, and Senator Feinstein, whose husband, Richard Blum, has investments in the development through a contract with Citations and Treasure Island and Lennar. You think that that's why they're keeping silent?
Well, obviously they have their interests, and I'm not talking about their political interests. I'm talking about their personal financial interests, and it's pretty hard. I hate to say this, but I think everybody kind of knows it implicitly, that when you get into business, you get into bed with a lot of people who are pretty shady. And there's organized crime is involved in a major way in the American banking system. That's been known for at least 50 years that I'm aware of. It goes back even to Bank of America when it used to be headquartered in San Francisco. So these interlocking directorates, as they say, the interconnections between financial interests and development interests and other corporate interests, it's a very dense web, but I think you probably tease out connections with any major project. And you would probably find underneath it that there's a lot of corruption going on.
And one of the cases also that you were involved in is Yesenia Guitron with Wells Fargo Bank. And I just noticed that they were fined for opening up fake bank accounts, $2,900,000 in California. Yet it doesn't seem there have been any criminal prosecutions, both by Trump, by Obama or Trump, and by Kamala Harris, who was the Attorney General of California. Right. It seems like, I guess you can open up fake bank accounts if you're a bank, but if you're a worker and open it up, then it's a different story.
Indeed. I do write for Broken Broker, the Wall Street blog, from time to time. And since I was involved with Ms. Guitron's case when I was in OSHA, and also a couple of other cases, I had some special inside knowledge about what was going on with Wells Fargo. And I made a report to the grand jury in San Francisco about over a year ago. And, very quietly, that grand jury has been closed and disappeared. And then when I found out that was going on, I challenged the Department of Justice, started writing to them, and it got curiouser and curiouser, as they say. But basically the last word I heard from them was, please don't write us anymore. We can't answer your questions about why we're not doing anything.
And again, this is Jeff Sessions, the U.S. Attorney General, and he wants to clean up the swamp, and yet here we have Wells Fargo executives getting off scot-free. In fact, President Obama allowed the CEO, Strump, to leave with $100 million after he admitted that they'd opened up fake bank accounts. I mean, I guess it's a pretty good payoff. If you're the CEO and you open up fake bank accounts, you can still leave with a lot of money.
And of course, now they're opening another investigation into the wealth management division of Wells. There's almost no part of Wells untouched by corruption. Would you say it's a criminal syndicate? Yes. Oh, obviously. I mean, is it anything other than that? We got these RICO laws are actually relatively recent. They go back to the 1960s. And the reason they were adopted was back in that day, you had Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, and you had Ramsey Clark, and you had a couple of other very progressive, very public-minded people in that department, and they began to see the pattern. And actually, the whole RICO legal arrangement came from the fact that they were finding, the corruption of politicians, local, mostly in cities, but some in states, was pretty widespread. And to get at it, they needed a new legal system of laws, which we now have with RICO. And RICO can be a very powerful way to attack corruption because there's both criminal and civil parts to RICO. But when you have this corruption that's knitted together between different groups, and then it invades and takes over parts of the government, those are all classic RICO cases. So whether you're looking at Wells, or I think if you're looking at what's going on at Hunters Point, you could very easily apply RICO to these cases. And then you would have some powerful tools, legal tools, to go after the problem. But of course, there's a lot of politics to that too. And I suspect that some very powerful politicians that you know and I know really don't want that to happen, because ultimately it would begin to unravel their own personal and political relationships with these powerful people. Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us on WorkWeek Radio, KPFA. We've been talking with Darrell Whitman, who is was a federal lawyer and investigator with the Whistleblower Protection Program. He was retaliated against for basically opposing a cover-up of workers' cases who had been retaliated against at FedEx, at Lockheed Martin, at PG&E, at Wells Fargo, for trying to defend the public, to defend their fellow workers around health and safety issues. And unfortunately, it's spread out. It seems to be a full-scale cancer in the U.S. government. Darrell. People need to connect the dots. They have to understand it's not Southwest Airlines, an executive here or a manager there. It's a system, and they're not any less at risk if they get on United or they get on American. I mean, they're all at risk.